So the most successful homeschooling families I know have moms who are curious about the world around them and love to learn themselves. Because if the mom is curious and loves to learn, she will bring her kids along with her.
Thank you for tuning in to the Removing Barriers podcast. I'm Jay.
And I'm MCG.
And we're attempting to remove barriers so we can all have a clear view of the cross.
This is episode 194 of the Removing Barriers podcast. And in this episode, we will be sitting down with Tricia to talk about the importance of homeschooling in today's culture.
Hi, this is Jay. MCG and I would like for you to help us remove barriers by going to removingbarriers.net and subscribing to receive all things removing barriers. If you'd like to take your efforts a bit further and help us keep the mics on, consider donating at removingbarriers.net/donate. Removing Barriers, a clear view of the cross.
Tricia, it is indeed a pleasure, and welcome to the Removing Barriers podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here today.
Great. Well, let's get into it.
I am so excited to get into this because this is a subject that I am waist deep in right now. And it's an honor to speak to a veteran who has graduated too already and they've fled the nest and they're on their own. And so we really look forward and are grateful for you sharing your knowledge with us, Tricia. So let's begin with your story regarding homeschooling. What drove you and your husband to decide to homeschool your children?
Oh, okay. So this probably is going to be a little bit different than most homeschooling parents' stories. So our homeschooling journey started back when I was actually 7 months pregnant with our son, our first child. And at that particular time, I was in college and I was actually finishing my final practicum before graduating. For the practicum, I was actually working in a grade 6 class in a bilingual French-English school in central Alberta. And the teacher I was working with was the vice principal of the school. Now, just to kind of give you an idea of what things were like in this particular classroom, every morning when she would come, so the vice principal, she would come, she would unlock the door to let me into the classroom, and she would, without fail, mutter under her breath, "Oh, I hate it here. I hate this job." And I thought, oh, this is delightful. So after I started working with her, I understood why she felt that way. So we had a homeroom class, grade 6 again. There were 30 students in it, general ed class. And in that class, we had 3 ESL students, so English as a second language. We had 6 students that were diagnosed with behavioral disorders. And I don't even know how many we had that had learning disabilities. So again, regular ed classroom in the late 1990s. Well, one day in particular, the students were doing a quiet reading assignment, and I was there to supervise and to ensure they were staying on task. And one of the things that we had in the school were these little snack shack tokens. So for positive reinforcement, I was going up to students and saying, "Great job, you're on task. Here's a snack shack token, so you can be rewarded for it." Well, as I was going about the classroom that particular day, there was this little girl. Her name was Erica. And Erica, she was pretty unique. So she was, like I said, I was in a 6th grade classroom, but she was more at about an 8th grade level. She was very advanced, very intelligent. So I went up to her and I went to hand her a token, and I said something similar to what I just said to her. And she looked up at me, and I'll never forget it because this was the moment that changed everything. She looked up at me and she said, "You know what?" She just had this defeat in her eyes. She said, "Do you know what? My teacher never noticed this because she's always so busy with the bad kids." And I thought, my dear, here is this intelligent, bright, hardworking young lady in 6th grade. She was hardworking, very diligent at her work. And I just saw her future right there. I thought, this girl is either going to be so discouraged, she's going to give up altogether, or she's going to become outright rebellious. Because I believe that's what happens to kids when they don't have the impetus to keep going. So that entire drive home that night, we lived about a half an hour away from where I worked. And the entire drive home, I just kept thinking about it. And of course, I was thinking about my unborn child because I was 7 months pregnant at the time. And I got home and I remember walking to the living room. My husband was already home. He was sitting on the couch. And one of the first things I said was, what do you think about homeschooling our kids? And I know I took him off guard. He was definitely like, what? You just got home from work, what? But he was like, well, whatever you feel is best. I mean, I'll support you. And so that was great. But at the time, so again, this is in the late 90s, this is 99, homeschooling wasn't really a big thing. So there weren't a lot of people who were doing it. There wasn't a lot of resources or helps or support like there is now. And the only two homeschooling families that we knew were ones who went to our church. And they were a very strange lot. They literally lived across from each other, like next door to each other on acreages with a fence dividing them. Mm-hmm. But what happened on one side of the fence was so different than what happened on the other side of the fence. So the one family on the one side, every morning the kids woke up at 7 a.m. to marching music. They schooled intensely until 5 p.m. Like everything was extremely regimented. And then the family on the other side of the fence were more kind of what we would call unschoolers. Mm-hmm. Laissez-faire, life will happen, you'll eventually learn things. And so this was our introduction to homeschooling. This is how we started. And our first exposure was very much like opposite ends of the pendulum. And so we kind of had to figure our way out from the ground up from there on.
For me, what you just described, I didn't have to experience, but I got chills on the right side of my body, down my back, just thinking about it. Jumping into something brand new, you have two extremes represented, right? And you're trying to do this for your unborn child. And where do you begin? How do you know what to do or where to go or how to structure your homeschool? How did you figure all of that out?
Well, I like to think that I started homeschooling from birth because right away it was like, this is the direction that we're going. And so what can I do? No matter what, I knew that I wanted to give my children the best education and the best opportunities possible. And I knew that sending them off to public school wasn't going to accomplish that. Mm-hmm. So basically, I just started winging it. I read what I could. There wasn't much out there at the time, but I read what I could. And then I quickly realized, okay, well, that's not me. I can't do that or what have you. And so it was a lot of trial and error at the beginning, a lot of trial and error. When we officially started homeschooling, at school age, at that particular time, there was a little bit more supports around the 2000, I guess that would have been about 2005. And so at that time, there was a little bit more, it was becoming more popular. There was a little bit more options. So yes, even the internet wasn't something really back then. So it's not like you could look online and find resources. So yeah, it was challenging, but it was a lot of fun. I love it. I look back on my homeschooling journey and it was one of the best times of my life.
Well, you speak so highly of it. And so it sounds like you would probably say that homeschooling is probably the best option for children. Is that the case? Or do you believe that homeschooling is for some kids, maybe not so much for others, for some families, maybe not for other families?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. So obviously, in a general sense, I would say, yes, homeschooling is the best option. That's because parents should be the ones who know their kids best. They should be the ones most equipped to help them learn and grow. Right. If you spend the first few years of their lives as they're growing up, you get to know their personalities, you get to know what they're good at, what they're not so good at, areas they need to grow in, their strengths. One benefit that I see to homeschooling is that the children learn how to interact with people of all ages and abilities. In a homeschool setting, they have to work within a family structure. And so everyone's at different levels. You've got younger kids, you've got older kids, you've got parents. If you're involved in any sort of homeschool communities or extracurricular activities, then you have a lot of dynamics there for the young people to learn from and to grow in. The opposite is true, though, in public school. And this is where I would say that homeschooling is better, because in public school, something I never really thought about until I don't know how many years into schooling. Probably my kids were in their preteens at the time, but a public school is a really unnatural environment because you have young people who are all the exact same age, pretty much homogenous in terms of their abilities, their levels, and all of that. And you don't find that in the real world. So homeschooling gives you the opportunity to be able to interact with people of different age groups. And like I said, different levels, different abilities. Another thing in terms of whether or not it's the best option, since I started homeschooling many, many years ago, there's been a greater and greater deterioration of the public system, where now it seems it's no longer about educating children. There seems to be other things at play within the educational system itself. And I don't see that as healthy or helpful long term. Now, I should say I am speaking in general terms. I know that there are good teachers out there. I know that there are good schools. I'm just kind of giving a broad brushstroke about the trend that I'm seeing. Now, is it for everybody? I would say no. I can't say that it is. And there's reason why. Sometimes, for example, a child has challenges that maybe you as a parent simply don't have the ability or knowledge or resources to address. And something more is needed for them, maybe some sort of professional or structure or something like that. So that would be things like, I don't know, I could think of autism or ADHD or dyslexia. There's all kinds of different issues that can crop up that parents might not feel as well equipped to deal with. It doesn't mean that they can't get resources to use in their homeschooling, but sometimes it's just not an option. And other times I would say that there are home situations that just aren't ideal for homeschooling. Unfortunately, we live in a broken world, a fallen world, and sometimes there's just home structures or home situations that homeschooling might not be the ideal. And really for me, in my mind, either way, a parent is ultimately responsible before the Lord for their child's education and upbringing. So whether you send them to school or whether you homeschool them, either way, your responsibility doesn't change.
Yeah, definitely. I think you kind of touched on it a little bit, but if you could zoom in on it a little bit more, what do you think that you were able to instill in your kids that a public school was unable to?
Well, off the bat, as a Christian, I would say that any sort of training in scripture, I mean, that was definitely something that a public school would not have instilled. And I guess when I was homeschooling, I had two goals, which would be definitely not on a public school radar. And my two goals were, number one, to instill a love of God and his word in my children. And the second goal was to instill a love of learning. I really wanted them to be lifelong learners. Curriculum to me was secondary to those two goals. So often parents focus on accomplishing a certain set of curriculum. We've got to get this done. We've got to get this done. But I really think that these are the two main things that would be ideal to focus on. Because if your children have a love for the Lord and a love for his word, and if they have a love of reading, a love of learning, a love of exploring the world and God's creation, then God can use them in any circumstance.
Absolutely.
And he'll teach them what they need to know if you miss something in your homeschooling journey. So I firmly believe that those two things are things that public education definitely wouldn't have instilled in my kids. And another thing, actually, one thing that I do think about is all the things that wasn't instilled in my children that would have been if they had gone to public school. Like, I don't know about you. I grew up in the public system. And whenever I think of my public school education, I don't remember a lesson. I don't remember a project. I don't remember anything academic that I learned. But I do remember a lot of bad things, like just a lot of bad things.
Right.
Bad habits or bad actions and things like that. So for me, yeah, it's a completely different environment, homeschooling your kids, because you said it. You have control over it. Whereas in the public system, you don't know. It's a mixed bag. It could be all kinds of different influences and things like that.
Yeah.
It's also the fact that parents don't exactly know who their kids are being influenced by. They think that maybe the teacher is there and perhaps they'll have influence from their students, but it's the teacher's prerogative. They could have anyone come in and talk to the students. In fact, I was talking to one of the ladies at our church This was several years ago, right at the beginning of the pandemic, and she was new to the church, military family, so quite transient. She wasn't going to be here for long, but she put her child in the public school system of our area, and she was blown away because they had taken her child out of class and sat him down in a special group. Now, this is without her knowledge. She only found out weeks later when the kid is like, oh, we did this, that, or the other. They sat that child down and talked to them about pronouns and about how you want to be addressed and how do you feel that you should be addressed. And if your parents think otherwise, we'll just keep it in this circle. And she was blown away. She couldn't believe her ears that they would even dare to talk to her, the children about these things without parents' intervention or knowledge. And I was raised in the public school system myself, and I saw some pretty crazy things, experienced some rough things that a homeschooler would not have experienced. But even in my lifetime, the schools that children were in my day compared to the schools that children are in right now, the difference is, I cannot believe how different it is. And so I suppose you and I would agree that public school, okay, that's a wash. We already know that there's nothing there.
I think the pandemic really exposed it because a lot of parents who thought, even secular parents who thought, okay, my kids are going to a good school, it has a good reputation, we've got award-winning teachers, etc. Now their kids are at home and they're seeing what their kids are learning. I know I've talked to a bunch of moms who said this, and they're not even saved. My sister is even one of them, where she's just like, whether it's bullying that's happening at school, whether it's things that they're being taught that the parents don't feel is appropriate, whether it's an overreach in some other area that the teacher or the principal is having. The pandemic really exposed a lot of what was going on in the system that was laying kind of beneath the surface, that unless a child like your friend's son said, oh, we did this in school, the parents have no idea.
Would have never known. So, okay, so public schools are a wash. Now, what about Christian schools? Because you would assume in a Christian school, you've got Christian teachers, Christian leaders, Christian administrators, and perhaps some percent, who knows what percent of your classmates are Christian or at least are professing to be Christian. So the environment should be better for kids, right? So what are some things that you were able to instill in your children that Christian schools would not have been able to do?
Well, okay, so we have to take a step back for a second because you've got a couple different kinds of Christian schools and some different things going on. So there's typically two models. The one is a closed enrollment Christian school. So that would be children who attend that particular church or are in that particular denomination. Those are the only people who can go there. And then you have an open enrollment school. It's a Christian school, so whoever decides their child is going to be a part of it, they know ahead of time the Bible is going to be taught, we're going to have prayer, etc. However, the enrollment is open up to the broader community. So in a closed enrollment school, it could be good. I mean, potentially it could be good. I think as a parent, you would still want to be involved, at least me. Maybe I'm a little hypervigilant. I don't know after working in the school system. But you'd still want to know what's going on. But definitely an open enrollment school, it's almost no different than a public school because potentially the children that you have there, like you said, a portion of them are definitely not going to be saved, not going to be churched. And so then that level of influence is, to me, almost the same as if your child was just in a public school together. At least in a public school, parents know they're sending their kid into a secular environment. And so they're anticipating it as a Christian parent.
Right.
But sending your child to an open enrollment or any sort of Christian school, really, you assume it's going to be a safe environment. And again, you still don't know. You still don't know. So thinking about that, I don't know. At Christian school, yeah, definitely. I think that I still instilled different values and different ideologies into my children than they even would have received there. And I think it's the difference of the models because, well, going back a little bit, the way we do life now is relatively new.
True.
Prior to the Industrial Revolution, families were together all the time. They worked together, they schooled together. It was almost like an apprenticeship for children where they learned the family trade, whether it was on the farm, at their business that they ran, what have you. And along that road, they were educated, not just in the skills that they needed, but they were also educated in character.
Right.
Because the kids were working alongside their parents, then there was something instilled in them. There was a hard work ethic, good work ethic for hard work. It was honesty, integrity, all of these other things that even in a Christian school, I don't know that it would be instilled in children. Not the same way, not to the same level that a parent could do that.
Right.
And for me, that's the biggest driver. Eventually, when I kind of got my feet under me and figured out this whole homeschooling thing and was kind of like, where am I going? What am I doing? Why am I doing this? Then it was instilling character in my kids. Often as parents, I don't know why we don't do this, but we don't ask ourselves, who am I raising? What is this child going to be like when they're 18, 25, 40 years old? What kind of adults are they going to be productive in society? Like, are they going to have a love for the Lord and want to teach, as the Bible says, teach it to the children's children?
Right.
Because a character is the only thing, and a faith, those are the only things that they're really going to take with them into adulthood and that will really impact the next generation. A Christian school, I don't think, could instill those things in a child. It's not their goal.
Yeah.
But as a parent, that was my goal.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because a lot of times folk will say, look, I think it might be the personality or the approach of the parents. A lot of times a parents will, let's say even church, a lot of parents will ignore teaching the Bible to their kids because figure, well, they get it at church. And I wonder if the same can be true about schooling in terms of a Christian school where the parent may say, hey, I don't really need to instill character because they're going to a Christian school, they're going to be learning character. So with that in mind, how should we handle the difference in personality in terms of parents with your kids that will be maybe cause success or maybe even cause failure in homeschooling?
Well, I'm going to go back a little bit to what you just said there about farming out responsibilities.
Right.
Let's face it, that's what it is. You're farming out responsibilities. You have expectations that are not realistic, and that God calls you to be responsible for your child, not the church, not the Christian school, not the public school, you. And parents, we have to ask ourselves, and do this regularly, but ask yourself, do I have the heart of my child? Because there's a worldview out there. They're going to get a worldview somewhere. Someone is influencing them. They're always being influenced. Who has the heart? Who's driving the ship? And parents need to matter more than peers.
Yep.
They absolutely have to, or more than social media, more than teachers. You have to have your child's heart. And it's lazy parenting. And maybe I'm being harsh, but this is, okay, I think this, that it's lazy parenting to just coast along and let your children be shaped. Your children are going to be shaped by something, by someone. Is it you? We have to be very intentional with our parenting. And I'm not just talking in the area of homeschooling, I'm talking about parenting in general. That was something that I guess having a fear of God in the area of parenting or of raising your children, this is a huge responsibility, and praise God, a huge blessing. And God entrusts us to do it. And he'll enable us. But okay, on to your question about personalities. Well, obviously people have different God-given abilities and talents. And so one parent is going to be, more organized than the next, or one parent is going to be more creative than the next. And so obviously each homeschool is going to be different. They're not going to be cookie cutters one of another. I guess one thing that I've learned over the years is that there's a certain type of parent who, well, I should say mother. The key to that makes or breaks a homeschool is the mom. It really is, hands down. No pressure, moms.
I was just thinking that.
But in my experience, I've had a lot of moms over the years come to me and ask advice or, for different areas of their homeschool. And so I observe. I like observing. I like seeing, okay, what works, what doesn't work, what makes things tick, why are things successful and other things not so successful. And I'd have to say the most successful, and when I say successful, I mean joyful homeschooling families where the kids enjoy learning and have fun in the process. And the mom is in a constant state of being frazzled and at a wit's end. So when I say success, that's what I mean. So the most successful homeschooling families I know have moms who are curious about the world around them and love to learn themselves. Because if the mom is curious and loves to learn, she will bring her kids along with her. It's not a fight. If homeschooling hurts, you're doing it wrong. Really. God's commandments are not grievous.
Yep.
You know, and so those sorts of moms, they just tend to foster the same sort of wonder and curiosity in their children as well. And I'd say that that's the best kind of personality, or rather, I guess, character trait. That's the one that has the most impact in a successful home. As for other personality differences within families, obviously, your kids are going to be different. And as a parent, you have to be a student of your students. You have to really, whether a homeschooler or not, you should know your kids.
Right.
What are their likes? What are their dislikes? What's their abilities? What are they good at? What are things that they struggle with? What is God calling them to do in their lives? Can you see it? Can you see it starting to take shape? I could see it in my kids. When my son came up to me and said he wanted to do thus and so, I was like, yep.
Yeah, you had already seen it.
That.
Yeah.
I saw that coming a mile away. And then my daughter came to me and she said, Mom, I want to go into medicine. And I thought, what in the world? That's not what you're supposed to be doing. She was still a teenager at the time.
Right.
And one of the blessings of homeschool is you can tailor their education. Yeah. So we got her into pre-med classes. I mean, because you can do that, right?
Yeah.
But back to being a student of your students, you know, how do your kids learn best? Are they auditory learners, visual? Do they need to work with their hands to understand how things are? If you know these things about your kids, then you can provide the best resources for them. You can meet their needs. This is something a public or Christian school can't do. They can meet the child where they're at, whether it's level, ability, understanding, interests. We did a lot of that. What are you interested in? I would go and pick a couple of different curriculum for them to use within that interest. Something I thought was age appropriate and what I thought met the criteria of what I was wanting them to learn. And then they could choose the curriculum.
Right.
Out of these three, which one do you like? You want to study marine biology? I have three different ones. Which one do you find more fascinating? But because each child is different, what works for one might not work for the next.
So would that mean that the structure of the homeschool will vary from child to child as well, or from family to family, or?
Well, first of all, mom has to be flexible. I think if you're going to homeschool, like that is a number one on the list.
Because I totally can see, like, it always amazes me how we have 4 boys and each one is incredibly different from the other. They come from the same womb, but they are completely different people. And so I imagine because of that complex interplay, the difference between personalities, how they learn and how we interact with them because of our personalities, it seems like homeschool will be different for each child at different times. It just seems like it's going to be sort of a patchwork, maybe piecemeal sort of, hey, let's put it together like this to see if it works. And there isn't like a straight structure. Is that the case, or am I missing something?
You hit the nail on the head. I think you hit the nail on the head. And even with what you just said, I would love to look at my kids and be like, how in the world are you two so similar and yet so different? It's insane.
Yeah.
But no, I don't think there is one size fits all. I really don't. And what I find most moms do, which it leads to frustration, I always see it, they basically try to recreate everything about a public education classroom in their home. So they have a room. This is our school room. You each have your desk. You each have your books on there. You each have, we have, everything is the exact same. Yeah. And is that the best environment? It might be. Maybe your kids thrive in that environment. But it's okay to not do that as well. I know for us, we just lived a very busy life. My husband worked away from home for quite a few of our homeschooling years. And so I had to do, a little bit more of the heavy lifting in terms of what went on around the house. So we did a 4-day school week because doctor's appointments happen, kids get sick, emergencies come up.
Right.
So having a 4-day school week, I had those 4 days structured and 1 day was a flex day. So if, let's say, we schooled Monday to Friday or Monday to Thursday, Friday was our flex day. Tuesday, we have a doctor's appointment. Okay, we're taking Tuesday off this week. Everything's being moved. We're now schooling Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday.
Right.
Super easy to transition and change. Another thing that I did, which was a game changer, was floating time boxes. So what that was, instead of having a rigid schedule where every single day we get up and to marching music at 7 a.m., school straight through at 5 o'clock. Instead of that, what I would do is say, okay, we're taking an hour Monday, Wednesday, Friday to do history. Where it occurs in that day, I don't know, because I don't know what that day is going to hold. But 1 hour of that particular day will have that particular subject. And so that way I knew what had to get done in that day, but I wasn't stressed out that it's 10 o'clock. Why we haven't started? We have to get this done by 11 o'clock because at 11 o'clock we have this next thing to do. So I scheduled those subjects in what I call floating time boxes. So as long as it was within that day, it didn't matter when it occurred, as long as it got done. And it took a huge amount of stress off me. Our lives could happen because maybe you have an extremely late night at church the night before, and it's harder for everybody to get up the next day. Whatever, then start the day a little bit later. It's totally okay. You can still accomplish the same things, just in a little bit. So be flexible. Be flexible and try something. If it doesn't work, give yourself permission to do something different. I don't know why we as moms, we're like, I bought this curriculum. We have to finish this curriculum. It doesn't matter if you hate it and it's driving me mad. We have to finish
Well,
it.
you know what it is, right, Tricia? You know what it is. Moms are afraid of not doing right by their kids. They're afraid that their kids are going to grow up and have learning gaps, or maybe they're going to be weird, or maybe the kids will surpass them and they won't be ready for college, which means they won't be able to function, which means they're not going to be a contributing member of society. And so, I may be asking for a friend. I'm asking for a friend here, right? And so you have the weight of the world on your shoulders because you're thinking, every morning you wake up, you're thinking, oh my word, I hope I don't ruin these kids today. I hope I'm not setting these kids up for failure. And so perhaps that's why some moms are like, okay, we got to do this curriculum at this time. You got to get this done, that done. And I imagine that would create a very stressful homeschool, a very stressful environment for both the mom and the kids.
I totally agree. And I mean, we have to take a step back and say, what is education anyway? What is education? Does it only ever happen at a desk with a pencil and a book? I don't know why we have this crazy idea that that's the only time it happens, where I'm a firm believer that the world is a classroom. And I think that scripture backs that up. And so if you're out taking a walk in the forest with your kids, talk about what kind of trees are there, what types of flowers grow there, the variety of birds you see. Is anything here edible? How did people survive long ago in the woods without any grocery stores? Education really isn't that hard. And speaking of grocery stores, if you're out shopping and getting your groceries for the week with your kids, talk to them about what you're purchasing. Why are you purchasing it? Why choose that brand? Is it a better price? How can they know? You're teaching life skills. I remember years ago, I was at church. We were in the lobby, and this family friends that we have come in, and they had 3 kids. And I think it was like around October. And I said to their daughter, I don't know, maybe about 9 at the time, maybe 10. And I said to her, oh, so how's school going this year? And she looked up at me, kind of stiff-lipped, and she said, I hate math. And I thought, wow, these parents are sure missing the mark.
Yeah.
And then I began to show her, I'm like, oh, we need math to tell time and to cook or bake, to know how to save and spend money. Because to her, math was something she had to do confined to a desk.
Right. It was a worksheet or an assignment. It wasn't life. Right.
It wasn't a useful set of skills that you're going to use throughout the rest of your life. And so as you take your journey, instruct them along the way. Like, you don't have to be brilliant they're kids.
Yeah.
You automatically qualify as knowing more than they do.
That's a really good way to look at it. Yeah.
It's not that hard.
I'm thinking about that line from the Matilda movie where the parent is saying to Matilda, I'm big and you're small. I'm smart and you're not. Perhaps not with that attitude, but it is true. You are older than them. You've been in the world a few decades longer than they have. You probably know a little more
knowledge.
Right?
You've been down the road a little further. And even in terms of curriculum, I was extremely eclectic. I'm not a very good boxed curriculum person. I'm actually not a very good boxed anything person. But really, do whatever works for you. Just do whatever works for you. Each one of us is different. And I'm not fond of changing curriculums necessarily, but if you're noticing something's not working, change it. Mm-hmm. Why bang your head against the wall? Why have a fight every day when you homeschool your kids? If this isn't working, like another thing that bothers me, I'm going to just release a bee from my bonnet here for a second, but parents who cheap out on their homeschool curriculum, parents who go the most economical way possible. Now, forgive me if you're one of them, but I do want to challenge your thinking. You're investing in your child's future. You're potentially setting them up for their future career, their future family, your children's children. We're talking a long-term investment in the education of your kids. So don't cheap out. I'm not saying go out and buy the most expensive thing, but I'm saying at least consider buying something that actually helps them and that doesn't frustrate you or them. And so leave all options on the table. And I'm sorry, don't be a cheapskate.
Well, you mentioned that, and I'd like to just read this scripture quickly before we move on to a short break here. When you talk, Tricia, about teaching these kids wherever you go and not keeping it to, the workbook or the assignment, Deuteronomy 6 is exactly what we have in scripture as the mandate for that. Deuteronomy 6, and I'll just read it here, verse 6 says, "And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, when thou walkest by the way, when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. Thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes. And thou shalt write them down upon the posts of thy house and on the gates." And so literally, throughout every walk of your life, whether you wake up, go to bed, go to the store, go to the movies, go to the whatever. Oh, well, we're independent fundamental Baptists. We don't go to movies, right? But whatever we're doing
at the dinner table.
Right, at the dinner table. Whatever we're doing in life, teach the children as you go. And that seems to be the prescription in scripture.
I would agree. And one thing that I would just add to that is that, our kids are so amazing. Like, God entrusted us with these little people who we have no idea. One thing I love about kids, I absolutely love about kids, and I'll be totally transparent here. I hated kids growing up. I hated them. I told my mom I was never going to have them. And then I got saved and I realized, they don't have to be like that screaming child having a tantrum for the chocolate bar in the grocery store. They are what you make them.
Yeah.
And once I realized that, it was like, Lord, who am I having the privilege to shape? Did Susanna Wesley know that she was raising a Charles and a John? Did Charles Spurgeon's mom realize that she was raising the Prince of Preachers? We have no idea. This is an investment.
Right.
I think that's why I'm super passionate about it, is because, I think we take for granted the privilege and the awesome responsibility that we have in rearing our kids. And so now when I meet kids, I'm always like, oh, praise the Lord, I get to influence this little person. This is so exciting because I don't know who they're going to be. I don't know what impact my current interaction with them is going to have on the future. Amen. And that's awesome. That's awesome to think about.
Totally is. Totally.
All right. Well, we're going to take a little break from this discussion. We're sitting down with Tricia and we're talking about homeschooling and whether or not it's the best option for parents. You're listening to the Removing Barriers podcast. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for a consistent and reliable place to get all your Christian materials? Try ChristianBook.com. Started from humble beginnings in 1978, ChristianBook.com now offers a wide range of books, CDs, DVDs, homeschooling, and church supplies, plus more. So whether you are a parent, a homeschooler, a pastor, or a layperson, ChristianBook.com can be a one-stop shop for all your needs. Click the link in the description section below and check out the vast array of Christian materials ChristianBook.com has to offer. All right, let's jump right back into it, Tricia. Now, we're talking about homeschooling and how it's to be structured and how we take different personalities into account. But there's also one important thing that perhaps some folks don't consider when it comes to homeschooling, and it's the relationship between the parents. So how foundational is cooperation, communication, unity between couples when it comes to executing homeschool correctly? Or is homeschool one of those things where it could just be purely the mom's responsibility and the dad can check out, or vice versa? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I know that happens sometimes. I don't know if it's ideal, but but yes. Well, like I said, my husband had worked away from home for much of the time when my children were younger. So he left a lot of the homeschooling implementation and decision-making to me, which was fine because that's more my wheelhouse. I didn't mind at all. But his support in what I was doing really helped bolster my ability to do it, for sure, for sure. It would be very challenging in a marriage relationship where one partner was against homeschooling and the other was for it. I could see that being a very contentious issue. So, yeah. One thing I will say in terms of communication between couples, I had a friend years ago when I was first starting homeschooling, officially homeschooling my kids, and she was quite a bit further along in her homeschooling journey than I was. Actually, she had 6 kids and she was a professional teacher. So she was an awesome resource, really, really a fantastic resource. She had a lot of insight. I like to pick her brain, but I used her a lot as a kind of like a homeschooling mentor. I bounced ideas off of her. I would ask for curriculum recommendations. I would seek counsel when I felt stuck or when something I was doing wasn't working. So she was a really great blessing to me when I needed help because she had the expertise I was lacking. But once I had narrowed down, for example, my book list for the coming year, I would run it by my husband and ask him his thoughts. And then we would pray about it together before we would actually choose what we were going to do. And then I would go ahead and order it to implement it the following year. So I know for him, he really appreciated that because he didn't have the time to sift through the myriad of of choices that are out there.
Yeah.
He was just like, okay. And I would say to him, this is where I think they are. This is where I think they should be going. What do you think? And we would discuss it. I did have educational plans each year, just kind of a track to run on, a rough guide to follow. And I would check with him on that as well. And so the two of us worked, I guess, kind of tag teamed a little bit. But definitely, it was a huge blessing to have his support.
Can you imagine a scenario where let's say the father is not supportive because he feels like perhaps, the kids might get a better education in the school system, than staying home? Is that a situation where the mother would just have to submit, even though she's truly convicted that homeschooling is the best option?
That's a tough one. That's a really tough one. That would have to be definitely evaluated on a case-by-case basis, in my personal opinion, just because there could be other circumstances in there, the reasons why he's against it, she's for it, or vice versa.
Yeah.
So I think that would have to be definitely addressed on an individual level.
What about the many ways that homeschooling can go badly? There seems to be a huge push. I don't know if you're seeing this on your end because you're serving outside of the country and you're pretty much done with your homeschooling journey, at least right now. Wait till the grandkids start coming in, right? But it seems like right now in the United States, there is a sort of counter push or a counter revolution, if you would, against homeschooling, because when the pandemic hit, homeschooling exploded, especially when parents realized what their kids were being taught. But now there seems to be a reaction where homeschool graduates are coalescing and working together to, quote, expose homeschool and why it's not all it's cracked up to be and why kids should be in school. Or perhaps they're making an argument for why the government should be more involved in regulating homeschool. Some of these are homeschool graduates advocating for this. So how do you respond to some of the criticisms that homeschooling and homeschoolers are typically exposed to when it comes to the safety of the children, their level of education, their competence once graduating, those sorts of things? What are your thoughts on those?
So I'm Canadian. So where I come from, each province, I don't know how it works in the States, but each province has its different homeschooling setup, how you work within the government system. The province that I did most of my homeschooling in was awesome. Really, it was awesome. You got to choose a non-resident school board, and they assigned you a liaison, basically, to help you fulfill your schooling goals. So to make sure that the children are meeting whatever requirements are needed for the state. Thankfully, it wasn't anything, they weren't mandating certain curriculum or certain tests. You weren't teaching to the test or something like that. But they just wanted to make sure that it was kind of an accountability partner.
Sure.
And the wonderful thing about the liaison was they were a homeschooler themselves. They had homeschooled their own children, and they were an education professional. So the thing I really loved, the fellow I had, his name was Mr. Gurney. He's in heaven now, but he thought outside the box, and I blame him for my thinking. But the wonderful thing about that was the children didn't fall through the cracks. Mr. Gurney was a real blessing to us, our homeschooling facilitator, because he really taught me to think outside the box. But what he did was, the whole reason why he was there was just to make sure I was on track. It was accountability.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really great. That was really great. So depending on how the states are set up or the provinces are set up, you know, obviously some parents, like I said before, some parents I don't think should homeschool their kids just because of certain circumstances. Some kids, I don't think that they thrive in that environment as much. So sometimes the critics have, well, I'll give you an example. My sister, when I started homeschooling my kids, oh my dear, I got so much flack because it wasn't a thing.
Right.
So my youngest sister was a 4th grade teacher, and all she saw were the homeschool rejects.
Yeah.
So the kids who, for whatever reason, the parents had pulled them out of school, and then the kids weren't thriving, something was going on, they decided to put them back, and then she got stuck with the ones that were very far behind. So sometimes the critics, do they have a reason why they think they do? Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not all perfect. We don't have it all together. And sometimes circumstances and situations are just not ideal. I remember when I first started homeschooling, my mom had, because remember, I started the beginning of the 2020s, or 2020s, oh my dear, the 2000s. Right. My mom lamented to me, because my family wasn't saved. And so my mom lamented to me, she's like, oh, your poor kids. I wanted to take them to buy backpacks for their first day of school and school supplies, and they're not going to have that experience. And I thought, why can't I just go buy them backpacks and we could go pick out their own school supplies? They're not missing out on much here. And we still got a first day of school photo and, you know, all of that.
Yeah.
So sometimes I think that people who, well, for example, socialization, that's a huge one, a huge thing that critics say. Well, what about socialization? That my mom would say that to me a lot was, well, what about socialization? I remember one time saying to her, I said, Mom, do you remember every time you would get a phone call because I was socializing at school? What would happen to me when I got home?
True.
I said, when did school stop being about education and start being about socialization? Now, I'm not against socializing our kids. You can put them in soccer practice. You can put them in baseball. You can put them in, you know, whatever, name your extracurricular activity, art classes. So socialization is not a problem. Often people levy that at parents. Mr. Gurney, our homeschool facilitator, I remember once he told me a story. He said, one dad, homeschooling dad, kept getting asked about, well, what about socialization? What about socialization? And so the next person who told him that, he looked at them square in the face and he said, we socialize our kids. Every Friday, we beat them up and take their lunch money.
We give them the real public school experience.
He was like, I'm sick and tired of this. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But I think
it's not a strong argument at all. Yeah.
No, it's not. But I think that those people, they just think this is not normal. Right. This is not what I experienced. And so therefore it must be harmful. Or I know somebody who did it poorly And therefore, the broad brushstroke, everyone does it this exact same way.
Yeah. I grew up, in the Caribbean. Island I grew up in, homeschooling was non-existent. The only people that maybe homeschool would be maybe missionaries that come to the island with their kids, but locals is almost non-existent, except there was one family in my community that actually homeschooled. And that was a disaster because they had a weird religious belief. So the kids had to call the father, and I think the wife had to as well. Well, they weren't married. They were like common law marriage, but the wife had to refer to their husband. I know the kids definitely had to refer to him as my lord.
Wow.
It would be, yes, my lord,
yes, my lord,
no, my lord, whatever case may be. And I know a number of them, his girls were like my age, 1 year older, 1 year younger. And I know when the government cracked down on them, I was in my early to mid-teens, and they couldn't read.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
And the younger ones were in the same boat. They couldn't read. They couldn't count. But it was constant that they're homeschooling. And that was a big thing on the island because now you have kids that should be in, at least we refer to as secondary school and upper primary levels, that can't even read. And now they're going to have to go in the school system because the government cracked down on them. A lot of them, they didn't have birth certificates because they were all home birth that they didn't report to the government. It was just a whole big mess. And that's what a lot of people look at homeschooling. So now even today in the islands, there are two things in the islands that you never do. You never homeschool and you never send your kids to school in the month of August because that's the summer vacation. So if you have to go to school in the month of August, the whole month of August, that's summer vacation. It got so bad that usually school will open like the first week of September, like the first full week. So sometime it will fall on maybe the 31st of August. The government actually had to change the law because it was so taboo that it would be the first Monday of September. And not the first week, we're going into the first week of September. I say all that to say this, because we're talking about critics of homeschooling. How do you really combat that? Because for me, my wife was the one who has a desire to homeschool. For me, my experience with homeschooling was that. It was, you have teenage kids that can't read,
Yeah.
Talk to someone like me that have never seen it done properly.
Don't look at the Homeschooling Hall of Shame as a frame of reference. Well, yeah, I mean, do some people do it badly? Yes, but that doesn't mean that has to be you,
Right.
And I find that I myself am in this lot here with what I'm going to say. We think as homeschoolers, we have to prove something.
Yeah.
That we have to prove something, that I'm not harming my kids. They're getting a good education. Look at how social they are. We really feel that there's this great pressure that we have to prove ourselves. And it's to an unseen person. It's just to the world at large. And really, if we think about it, we're trying to prove it to ourselves. And it took me a long time to figure that out, that this is me versus me. This is not somebody else putting this pressure on me. This is myself putting this pressure on me.
Right.
And so I'm stressed out. And this is why I can't throw out a bad curriculum book or skip over a lesson because I don't realize it's me versus me. Those expectations are my expectations of myself.
Right.
And it's not realistic. And so I think that as a homeschooling parent, we have to realize that those people who say those things, they don't know what they're talking about. And I can say this because I'm on the other end of the homeschooling journey. When you're finished and your kids are adults, those around you will see a difference between your kids and other people's kids. I remember the day that my family actually said to me, wow, your kids aren't like so-and-so. Like, wow, your kids are actually really whatever. Your kids are well-rounded. My family even now tells me, and I mean, I think it's debatable as their mother, but my family says your kids are well-rounded adults. I still see the areas that they need to grow in, but they see the difference. Yeah. And so if you know why you're doing what you're doing, and you believe that you're doing what the Lord would have you to do, then you just need to be firm in that and keep walking in that, even if there is some pushback from other people. And sometimes it's justified. Sometimes you have to reevaluate yourself. I know I don't have it all together. There's going to be areas that I need improvement in. And so if there is pushback, evaluate it. If it's valid, adjust whatever you need to adjust. And if not, just keep marching. Just keep marching.
Wow.
Let's follow that same vein, Tricia, because burnout, particularly on the mom burnout for the mom is a real thing. And there are some mornings where, I'm afraid to get out of bed because, again, I'm wondering, how am I going to ruin these kids today? So can you talk to that issue about burnout? I know it's a genuine concern, but how should we as homeschool moms be dealing with it? Because it's definitely overwhelming. So what are some of your tips for dealing with the overwhelm, the burnout?
Sure. That's a really awesome question because in the, 25 years since I started my homeschooling journey, I get a lot of this from moms. Again, I'll go back to what I said earlier. If homeschooling hurts, you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
God gives us emotions for a reason.
Yeah.
And when there's pain, it's because that's a symptom of something. So if homeschooling hurts, stop and evaluate. Why is this hurting? What are we doing? What can be changed? When moms come to me, and typically what I hear from moms, it's not like, oh, I'm feeling so overwhelmed. Oh, I'm feeling burned out. It's this curriculum isn't working. Or the kids are driving me nuts. We're fighting all the time. What curriculum can you recommend for X subject?
Right.
And I give them 3 questions and I say, okay, take a step back. Can you tell me, why are you homeschooling? And most moms, surprisingly enough, don't have an answer. Or if they have an answer, they say, well, it's because, they shouldn't be in public school. Okay, great. But why? Why? What's your purpose in what you're doing? And homeschooling is homeschooling just because you feel it's expected of you, especially in your Christian circles, is a very bad reason to do it.
Right.
And more often than not, that would end in failure. So that would be the first question. Why are you doing what you're doing? The second question is, what's your philosophy of education? Everything you do has a philosophy undergirding it, whether you're aware of it or not. There's some belief system holding it up. So what is your philosophy? How are you doing what you're doing in your homeschool? That's how you can figure out if it's working or not. If it's not working, get a new philosophy. But now with the advent of the internet, a quick Google search and you can have a whole bunch of different ways to homeschool, different philosophies of homeschooling. Another thing is, and again, this isn't a competition. Go easy on yourself. Figure these things out. Have a good undergirding of what you're doing. The third question, though, I would say is what are you wanting to produce in this journey? And I touched on this earlier. Who are you trying to raise? If a mom can't answer those 3 questions, I say, go to your husband, write these 3 questions down. And they were, number 1, why are you homeschooling? Number 2, what's your philosophy of education? And number 3, what are you wanting to produce at the end of this journey? If you can't answer those 3 things, typically overwhelm comes from somewhere in there. Somewhere in there. If they don't know, which actually I've never had a mom answer all 3 of those questions, I say, go back to your husband, talk about it, pray about it, figure out where you stand on these 3 things, and then we'll talk again. And so typically overwhelm or burnout comes from that, not really having an idea of why we're doing what we're doing, how we're going to accomplish it. I mean, how in the world are you going to hit a target if you don't know what it is or what tools you're using to aim at it? Then the other thing I would say is have a good support group, whether it's burnout or overwhelm or however you want to call it. It's very difficult on moms when they do it alone. If you don't have family around, praise God, nowadays there's homeschool co-ops you can get involved in. Some churches, if they're large enough, they have a co-op group that you can join. But the reason how this helps, it's not just me versus the world. It's all these other parents who are in the same boat, some further along in their journey. They can help pull you along, give you the encouragement you need, give you resources if you need them. They can help. A lot of times the homeschooling co-ops have get-togethers, maybe once a month, where different parents will teach different things. Maybe one is good at art. They can teach the children art. Another one is carpenter, so he can teach them woodworking or what have you. So it's a sharing of the load, not just a support, but a sharing of the load. And so those things I find really help to not feel like, man, this is so tough.
Yeah,
hard
too
time.
much.
Exactly. Yeah, just having a good core of knowledgeable people around is very, very advantageous. Very advantageous, especially, like I said earlier, if you have a child you're trying to homeschool who has dyslexia or ADHD or autism or some other complicating factor. I was just talking to a mom this past week. She contacted me. I already thought her daughter was on the spectrum and something happened and it seems like it's confirming that, but she was struggling in her homeschooling. And I've read quite a bit about it. I've had homeschooling. I'm a teacher, so I've had students who were autistic, and so I was able to help her with some resources. So just having that network to support you is very, very helpful.
I want to ask a question along that line because I was a teacher for about a year and a half, and I did notice something that was pretty interesting in my student. So this was an all-girls high school, and it was like the cream of the crop in the islands. There was a complimentary all-boys portion of it as well, but you had to pass your entrance exam in the top tier to be able to enter the school. So I was a science teacher there. I say that just to say that, that most of the students in there are competitive. Like the first place student is average 98, 99,
Wow.
and persons that are averaging in the 60s or 70s are at the bottom of the class, just to give you the level of competition in the school. So I had this girl in my class, and for whatever reason, she was, somewhere in the middle, maybe closer to the bottom of the class in terms of test results and stuff like that. But as a science teacher, we'll do labs, not every week, but maybe every other week or so we'll take them to labs. And she was my best student in the lab. She was helpful. She was sharp. She was like, what? Is this the same student that in lecture, Then I realized, oh, she's a hands-on learner. She wants to be able to touch. She wanted to be able to do the experiments, and she was having fun, And I say all that, and also even my own encounter, because it wasn't until I was an adult I learned that I was mildly dyslexic. So I went through entire schooling with that, and after time I learned to cope. But I'm kind of glad, because the government in the Caribbean is a little bit different, but I'm kind of glad I didn't know, because even though some teachers kind of alluded to it, especially when I was doing my associate degree, but I'm kind of glad it wasn't under the hands of the government. And I think a lot of parents are afraid when they start talking about dyslexia, autism, attention disorder, and stuff like that. A lot of Christian parents get like, oh, then the government is going to come in, they're going to medicate my kid, they're going to do all these things with something that the kid, at least I would say in my situation, can learn to deal with it if they're not heavily medicated. What would your response be to that?
Well, it doesn't have to be that way. Because, like, for example, if you have to put your child in school for whatever reason, there's still a bit of autonomy, thankfully, for the parents in terms of medication and things like that. I mean, the parents are the ones who have to give the medication. And if the parents don't give it, the child doesn't get it. So there's certain things like that. But in terms of homeschooling, the wonderful thing nowadays is a quick Google search, and you can find all sorts of helps and resources for those kinds of things. So whether it's actually, curriculum that's tailored to that, or whether it's maybe a tutor who knows how to deal with that, there's things like preply.com. You can hire tutors for a very good price. Some of them are versed in these particular things. Maybe you need a reading tutor. So there's a lot of different resources out there that didn't exist before, so that parents can be equipped if they want to be equipped. That's the key, right? Sometimes it's like, as a parent, you just think, this is just too overwhelming for me. I don't think I can handle that. And so you have to kind of gauge where you're at. And again, a homeschooling co-op, I know for myself, I deal with dyslexic students quite frequently here when I teach in the classroom setting. And so other parents probably within a homeschool co-op, more than likely you'd have other parents who deal with that as well. And maybe they have resources, or so-and-so can help you, or talk to this person, or read this particular book. So I don't know. I think that, like you said, back when we were growing up, things were quite a bit different than they are now. And thank the Lord they've changed, and the opportunities and availabilities of helps are far greater than they used to be.
Yeah, this is going back to my experience, because I was doing an associate degree when I was first told. I think some of my high school teachers may have alluded to it. They alluded to some stuff, but they never really used the word dyslexic. I was doing an associate degree in computer programming, and one of my teachers wanted to talk to me. And I was like, and this was like after the test results. And I'm like, okay, I got a B plus, which is, is not an A, but is not bad. And I figure, I believe I could have gotten an A on the test, but whatever the reason. She just sat me down and she took my paper and she started going through all the stuff. And she was like, show me all the evidence where I messed up or where. Then she recommended that I go and do a dyslexia test. So I said, okay, I don't think I am, but I took her up on it because it was, for most part, free through the government. But at that point, I think I was like 18 or something like that. So I decided I'm going to go on the computer and start researching this thing as much as possible. So by the time the tests actually came around, I already knew so much about it. It was more like, yeah, I already know what the diagnosis is going to be here and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
like, for instance, even now, I still reverse numbers. But mentally, I know that I do that. So when I recall it, I just flip it around. I don't know how I do it.
You figured a workaround.
I just mentally flip it around. To me, I'm just like, should I send my kids to the government and they're going to come with all these crazy things? And I think that they can flip that around. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's something that, I mean, as a parent, if you have a child who you suspect has some sort of challenge in their learning abilities, is it better to know or to continue on and not know? What's the best thing for you and what's the best thing, especially for your child?
Right.
Is it better to know and possibly get the helps that they need? Or is it better to just try to keep plowing? For me, I think the former is more advantageous because then even as a parent, you need support when you have a child who has these sorts of, maybe it's neurodivergence, maybe it's some sort of learning disability or something like that. Just as a parent, knowing how to help your child is very important. And then, like I said, nowadays, there's a lot of curriculum that's tailored to different needs like that because there's been a lot more awareness of it in education, whereas before it was segregated. It was something that we don't talk about or we put over there, or now it's something that's more integrated within the education system itself. That's one reason why I was eclectic in my homeschooling, is because boxed curriculums. And so one size doesn't fit all for every child. And what worked one year might not work the next year for even the same kid.
Right. Yeah.
So you have to be very adaptable as a parent. But boxed curriculum, the reason why I don't care for them as much, I know a lot of moms like them because it's kind of like, I don't know, like a box of instant mashed potatoes.
Yeah. Everything's in the box. You don't have to think about it. Just go.
Water.
Yeah.
But the reason why I don't like it so much is that a lot of parents don't realize that those boxed curriculums, some of them, again, broad brushstroke, were created for our classroom use. They weren't even created for a homeschool. So what does that mean? It has extra work, busy work, extra practice sheets. And so mom comes along, buys the entire curriculum package, and then feels overwhelmed because there's just so much to do. Well, it was never intended to be completed in a classroom or in a homeschool that entire year, everything. So that's why I said flexibility is really important for parents, for the needs of your child. Like you said, kinesthetic learner, that girl in the lab, be flexible. Okay, well, I had that with my daughter. My son, I sat him down at 4.5 years old. I got some readers. We'd worked on his letters and all of that. He already knew it all. 4.5, we sat down. Within 2 weeks, he was reading like that. He was ready. He was just ready. I did the same thing with my daughter. Oh, my dear, I could have screamed trying to teach her how to read. It was horrible.
Yeah.
But then I talked to my friend, who I told you about earlier, who had 6 kids. And I said, okay, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. We've been 6 months trying to do this. It's so painful. And she said, why don't you try this particular curriculum? It's a hands-on curriculum. It's for phonetics, for phonics. She was reading within about 2 weeks as soon as I got it. Why?
Wow.
Because she's kinesthetic. She had to manipulate the letters to be able to read it. And I was so thankful that I learned that very early on in my homeschool journey. I was like, wow, one size does not fit all.
Yep.
My children are different.
Yeah.
Imagine that. So that's the beauty of homeschooling, is that we have that opportunity, especially if we're observers and learners of our kids, to be able to say, what do they need? Like, we can meet the needs of our children, not just quote unquote educate them or get them through a certain set of curriculum. You know, I remember talking to my homeschool facilitator years ago, and he always challenged me. And one day he said to me, when are your kids ready to graduate? I thought, oh, this is a trick question. I know I'm going to get it wrong. And I said, when they're 18. And he said, when they take their education in their own hands. When you are no longer the one facilitating it, then they're ready. And I was like, you're brilliant. I love you. That's amazing. But he challenged my paradigm of everything that I thought education was.
Right.
And so these are sort of the lessons that I learned along the way. And it served us really well. And any mom who's come to me and I've said, hey, why don't you try thinking outside the box? Why don't you try varying up your curriculum according to your child? Why don't you try? I even recommend doing some of your subjects together as a family. Mm-hmm. Why not do Bible together? Why not do history together? The little kids might not get as much. However, it takes a lot of pressure and stress off the mom, not so much overwhelm, because it's not every single subject every child has to do completely isolated on their own. Mm-hmm. What can you combine to ease your burden of teaching? Because let's face it, moms are pretty busy people. Yeah. I mean, even before homeschooling their kids, just taking care of a home, trying to keep everybody fed, everybody clean, exactly. Just survival is a big deal. That adding homeschool to the mix, I mean, how can we work smarter, not harder, as the saying goes?
Let me say, that's awesome too.
I'm all about efficiency.
I'm CG feeling kind of miffed over there, but all right. So let's bring all of this together. Let's tie a pretty bow on it and call it a package. So, we are responsible before God for the nurture and the admonition and the education of our children. And we've decided that homeschooling is probably going to be the best way to bring that about. So how can a family possibly teach their kids everything they need to know to thrive in life, but also to be true to what God has called them to be? And I guess what I'm asking is, where does the gospel fit into this? What is the gospel and how does it fit into our homeschool? And how does it define our homeschool?
Wow. So, 1 Corinthians 15 is the gospel, right? The death, burial, and resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. And obviously having him at the center of our homeschool is paramount. Just like in our home, whether you homeschool or not, that should be the goal of every Christian family. It's such a blessing, really, being able to seek the Lord's guidance, to be able to ask him every February or March. I would always be like, am I ruining my kids? Is this curriculum really working? I would second guess myself. Yeah. But I would always think, well, I prayed about this curriculum. I prayed about what we were going to do. And so this is the course that God put us on. This is the course we're going to keep walking on. And then I would start praying for the next year. Mm-hmm. What the Lord have us to do. So the gospel is very, very integral. Just having the Lord walk alongside us in this homeschooling journey. We don't have to do it alone. The Lord can be as much of a help as we ask him to be within our homeschool. And of course, raising our children for the Lord. That is such a privilege, such a blessing that we have these little disciples living amongst us. Sometimes it's very fear-inducing, like the fear of the Lord. Oh Lord, I have to discipline them because I taught them that. That's convicting. Yeah. But I've often told my kids, even nowadays with my children being adult, I often tell them, you've made me a better Christian. Being a parent has made me a better Christian. Absolutely. You've shown me. The Lord's used you to convict me. The Lord's used you to change me. Mm-hmm. And so really, homeschooling has so much to do. I don't know how people do it without the Lord. Yeah. He's just so integral, into our homes and into our lives.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Well, Tricia, it was indeed a pleasure. Thank you for joining us on the Removing Barriers podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Removing Barriers podcast. Did you know that you could find us on Twitter, Gab, Parler, Facebook, and Reddit? Go to removingbarriers.net/contact and like and follow us on social media. Removing Barriers, a clear view of the cross.
Thank you for listening. To get a hold of us, to support this podcast, or to learn more about Removing Barriers, go to removingbarriers.net. This has been the Removing Barriers podcast. We attempted to remove barriers so that we all can have a clear view of the cross.